The words cut through Kansas City's morning air like a blade through hope itself. "He's useless. Just euthanize him," they said, and the mule's ears drooped as if he understood every syllable of his death sentence. The livestock market buzzed with the casual cruelty of commerce, where animals became numbers and hearts became commodities. But when that weathered mule nudged the trembling girl with his velvet nose, something ancient stirred in the dust. Something that made every voice fall silent and every soul remember what it meant to be truly seen. The sun had barely kissed the horizon when the livestock trucks began rumbling into Kansas City's sprawling animal market, their cargo of hope and desperation rattling against metal walls. Dust clouds rose like prayers from the unpaved roads, settling on everything with the weight of countless dreams deferred. The air hung thick with the scent of hay, manure, and something else, the particular heaviness that comes when living beings are reduced to their monetary value. Mr. Cole stood at the edge of the loading dock, his weathered hands gripping a clipboard that held the fate of dozens of animals, each line item a story he'd never bothered to read. The mule emerged from the trailer with the dignity of the condemned, his grey coat dulled by neglect and his ribs visible beneath skin that had known too many hungry nights. His eyes, dark as midnight pools, held a weariness that spoke of years spent pulling loads too heavy for his frame, of being passed from owner to owner like a broken tool that nobody quite knew how to fix. The handlers moved around him with practiced indifference, their voices carrying the casual brutality of men who had forgotten that animals, like people, could feel the sting of rejection. "Look at this one," someone muttered, pointing at the mule's slightly crooked gait. "He's favoring that left hind leg, something fierce." Sarah pressed herself against the wooden fence that separated the viewing area from the auction pens, her small fingers curled around the rough planks like anchors in a storm. At 9 years old, she had already learned that the world was divided into two kinds of people, those who belonged somewhere and those who didn't. Her foster father, Mr. Cole, had brought her here not out of kindness, but out of necessity. There was nowhere else to leave her while he conducted his business. Her dress, a faded blue thing that had seen better days on someone else's body, hung loose on her thin frame, and her brown hair escaped from its braids in wisps that caught the morning light like spun gold. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the market like thunder, each syllable hammering home the reality that everything here had a price, and some prices were too low to sustain life. "Lot 47, he called out, and Sarah watched as the mule was led into the ring, his hooves clicking against the concrete with a rhythm that sounded almost like a heartbeat. The animal stood in the center of the circle, surrounded by men who looked at him the way people look at broken furniture, calculating whether the cost of repair exceeds the value of replacement. His ears swiveled forward and back, catching fragments of conversation that sealed his fate with each passing moment. Mr. Cole shifted beside her, his boots scraping against the ground as he consulted his watch with the impatience of a man who had more important places to be. "Waste of good feed," he muttered under his breath, his words carrying the weight of a verdict already rendered. Sarah felt something twist in her chest, a familiar ache that came whenever she heard that particular tone, the one that suggested some lives simply weren't worth the trouble they caused. She had heard it directed at herself more times than she cared to count, in the voices of social workers and temporary guardians who spoke about her as if she weren't standing right there, listening to every word. The bidding began with all the enthusiasm of a funeral march, voices calling out numbers that dropped lower and lower until they barely qualified as offers at all. $5, someone called, and the auctioneer's face showed the kind of disappointment reserved for sales that wouldn't even cover the cost of the paperwork. The mule stood perfectly still throughout the proceedings, as if he understood that his life was being measured in coins and found wanting. When the final gavel fell, the silence that followed felt like the moment between lightning and thunder, pregnant with the promise of something terrible about to unfold. The buyer who claimed the mule for $7.50 had the look of a man who collected broken things, not to fix them, but to dispose of them properly. His name was Henderson, and he ran a rendering plant on the outskirts of town where animals went to become something other than themselves: soap, glue, fertilizer, anything but the breathing, feeling creatures they had once been. He approached the mule with the detached efficiency of an undertaker, running his hands over the animal's flanks with the clinical touch of someone assessing raw materials rather than examining a living being. "He's useless. Just euthanize him," Henderson said to his assistant, the words falling from his lips with the casual cruelty of a man who had spoken them too many times before. Sarah felt the words hit her like physical blows, each syllable landing in her chest with the weight of recognition. She knew that tone, had heard it in the voices of people who were supposed to care for her, but found her too difficult, too damaged, too much trouble for the small amount of love they were willing to invest. The mule's ears drooped at the sound, as if he too understood the language of dismissal, the particular vocabulary that the world used when it decided you were no longer worth keeping. His dark eyes swept across the crowd of faces, searching for something, mercy perhaps, or simply acknowledgement that his life had meant something to someone, somewhere. Mr. Cole was already turning away, his business concluded, and his attention shifting to the next item on his endless list of responsibilities. Sarah was just another burden to be managed, another mouth to feed, until the state found her a more permanent placement. He had made it clear from the beginning that her stay at his ranch was temporary, a favor to an old friend who worked in social services and needed a place to park a difficult child while the paperwork sorted itself out. "Come on, girl," he said without looking back, his voice carrying the same dismissive tone that Henderson had used with the mule. "We've got chores waiting at home." But Sarah couldn't move. Something in the mule's eyes held her frozen in place, a recognition that passed between them like a secret shared in a language that only the unwanted could speak. She had seen that look in her own reflection countless times, the quiet resignation of someone who had learned not to expect rescue, not to hope for hands that would reach out in kindness rather than push away in frustration. The animal stood perfectly still in the center of the ring, his head held high despite the verdict that had been passed upon him, and Sarah felt something stir in her chest that she hadn't felt in months. The dangerous, foolish impulse to care about something other than her own survival. The crowd began to disperse as Henderson's assistant approached with a lead rope, the business of the day moving forward with the inexorable momentum of a machine that ground up the inconvenient and the unprofitable without pause or reflection. Sarah watched as the man reached for the mule's halter, his movements quick and efficient, designed to minimize the time between decision and execution. The animal didn't resist, didn't fight or flee, but simply stood there with the dignity of someone who had accepted their fate while still maintaining their essential self. It was a kind of courage that Sarah recognized, the quiet bravery of continuing to exist in a world that had made it clear you weren't welcome. The moment stretched like a held breath, suspended between what was and what might be. And in that space, Sarah felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking but opening, like a door that had been locked for so long she had forgotten it was there. The mule turned his head slightly, his gaze finding hers across the distance that separated them, and in his eyes she saw not resignation, but a question, a gentle inquiry that seemed to ask whether she, too, knew what it meant to be deemed worthless by people who had never bothered to look closely enough to see what was actually there. The connection lasted only a moment, but it was enough to change everything that came after. The crowd remained frozen in that strange tableau, as if the very air had thickened around them. Mr. Cole's weathered hand still gripped the halter rope, but his knuckles had gone white, and something in his chest felt like it was cracking open. He had seen plenty of animals in his 50 years, horses that could run like the wind, cattle that could feed a family through winter, dogs that would die protecting their masters. But he had never seen anything quite like what had just passed between this broken-down mule and this forgotten child. The silence stretched on, heavy with the weight of unspoken truths, and Cole found himself unable to move forward with what he had planned to do. Sarah's small hand had found its way to the mule's neck, her fingers tangling in the coarse hair there, and the animal stood perfectly still, as if he understood that this moment was sacred. The other men shifted uncomfortably, their boots scraping against the dusty ground, but none of them spoke. They had all seen it too. That flash of recognition, that moment when two lost souls had found each other in a world that had no use for either of them. The mule's breathing had steadied, his ribs no longer heaving with the panic that had consumed him moments before. His dark eyes, still fixed on Sarah's face, held a gentleness that seemed impossible in an animal that had been beaten down by years of hard labor and harder treatment. Sarah's own breathing had slowed to match his, and for the first time since her parents had died, the constant ache in her chest felt bearable. She didn't understand what was happening, couldn't put words to the feeling that was spreading through her like warm honey, but she knew that something important had just occurred. The mule's nose was soft against her palm, softer than anything she had touched in months, and when he exhaled, his breath was warm and sweet with the smell of hay. She had never been this close to an animal before. Her parents had been city folk, and the orphanage had no use for pets. But somehow she knew exactly what to do. Her other hand came up to stroke the white blaze that ran down the center of his face, and the mule's eyes drifted closed, as if he were savoring the first kind touch he had received in longer than he could remember. Mr. Cole felt his resolve crumbling like sand through his fingers. He had come here with a purpose, had made the hard decision that needed to be made, but now he found himself questioning everything. The mule was old, that much was true, and his back was swayed from years of carrying loads too heavy for his frame. His hooves were cracked, his coat was dull, and there were scars on his flanks that spoke of whips and spurs, and the casual cruelty of men who saw animals as nothing more than tools to be used up and discarded. But there was something else there too, something that Cole was only now beginning to see. The way the mule held himself when Sarah touched him, the careful gentleness with which he lowered his great head to her level, the patience in his stance as she explored his face with her small hands. These were not the actions of a worthless animal. These were the actions of a creature who understood suffering, who recognized it in another, and who chose to offer comfort instead of turning away. Cole's throat felt tight, and he had to swallow hard before he could trust himself to speak. When he finally did, his voice came out rougher than he had intended, scraped raw by emotions he couldn't quite name. "Sarah," he said quietly, and the girl's head turned toward him, though her hands never left the mule's neck. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but there was something else there too, a spark of hope that Cole hadn't seen since the day she had arrived at his ranch, hollow-eyed and silent with grief. "What do you think of this old fellow?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with possibilities that neither of them had dared to imagine just moments before. Sarah looked back at the mule, studying his face with the serious intensity that children brought to important decisions. The mule gazed back at her, his ears pricked forward, as if he too were waiting for her answer. The other men had begun to mutter among themselves, their voices low and uncertain, but Cole paid them no attention. All that mattered now was the girl and the mule, and the strange magic that had passed between them. Sarah's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but then she closed them again, her brow furrowing with concentration. She was 9 years old, but she had learned early that words had power, that they could hurt or heal, that they could change everything in an instant. The sun had begun its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that seemed to set the whole world on fire. The light fell across Sarah's face. illuminating the freckles that dotted her nose and the determined set of her jaw. She had made her decision. Cole could see it in the way her shoulders straightened, in the way her chin lifted just slightly. The mule seemed to sense it too, his ears swiveling toward her as if he were straining to catch every word she might speak. The crowd had grown restless, some of the men beginning to drift away toward other pens, other animals, other business that needed attending to, but a core group remained, drawn by the same inexplicable pull that had kept Cole rooted to this spot. They were witnessing something, though none of them could have said exactly what. It was the kind of moment that would be talked about for years afterward, the kind of story that would grow in the telling until it became legend. But for now it was just a girl and a mule, and the space between heartbeats where everything hung in the balance. "He's not useless," Sarah said finally, her voice clear and strong despite the tears that had begun to spill down her cheeks. "He's just been waiting for someone to see him." The words hit Cole like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and leaving him gasping. Because he knew, with the sudden clarity that sometimes comes in moments of crisis, that she wasn't just talking about the mule. She was talking about herself, about the way she had been shuffled from place to place since her parents' death, about the way people looked through her as if she weren't really there. And maybe, just maybe, she was talking about him too, about the way he had been going through the motions of living ever since his own wife had died, about the way he had closed his heart to anything that might require him to feel again. The mule nickered softly, a sound so gentle it was barely audible above the noise of the market, and Sarah smiled through her tears, the first real smile Cole had seen from her since she had come to live with him. The transaction that followed felt like something out of a dream, surreal and weighted with significance that none of the participants fully understood. Mr. Cole found himself reaching into his vest pocket for his worn leather wallet, his fingers moving of their own accord, while his mind struggled to catch up with what his heart had already decided. The auctioneer, a thin man with nervous eyes and tobacco-stained teeth, quoted a price that was laughably low, barely enough to cover the cost of hauling the mule's carcass away. But Cole handed over the bills without haggling, without even really hearing the amount. The money changed hands with the solemnity of a sacred ritual, and suddenly the mule belonged to them, this unlikely family of broken souls who had found each other in the most unexpected of places. Sarah's hand never left the animal's neck throughout the entire exchange, as if she were afraid that he might disappear if she let go, that this moment of connection might prove to be nothing more than a cruel mirage. The mule stood perfectly still, his dark eyes moving between the girl and the man who had just purchased his life, and there was something in his gaze that spoke of understanding, of gratitude that ran deeper than words could express. The walk back to Cole's wagon was a slow procession, marked by the careful pace of the old mule and the wondering stares of the people they passed. Word had already begun to spread through the market about what had happened, the story growing and changing with each telling, but the essential truth remained the same. A worthless animal had been saved by the compassion of a child, and somehow that simple act had transformed everyone who witnessed it. Cole led the way, the mule's lead rope loose in his hand, while Sarah walked beside the animal, her small fingers still tangled in his mane. She had begun to talk to him in a low, steady voice, telling him about the ranch where he would live, about the pasture where he could graze, about the barn where he would be safe from the storms that swept across the Kansas plains. The mule's ears swiveled toward her voice, and occasionally he would lower his head to nuzzle her shoulder, as if to reassure her that he was listening, that he understood every word. Cole found himself listening too, surprised by the detailed picture Sarah painted of their home, by the way she seemed to see possibilities where he had only seen problems. She talked about the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the property, about how the mule could drink from it whenever he was thirsty, about how the water was always cool and clear even in the heat of summer. When they reached the wagon, Cole realized he faced a practical problem he hadn't considered, how to transport an animal that was too old and frail to make the journey on foot, but too large to fit in the back of the wagon with the supplies he had already loaded. For a moment he stood there scratching his head, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake, if his moment of sentiment was going to strand them all here in town with no way to get home. But Sarah, with the problem-solving instincts of a child who had learned to adapt to whatever life threw at her, had already begun rearranging the sacks of grain and flour, creating a space just large enough for the mule to lie down if he needed to rest. "He can walk most of the way," she said confidently, as if she had been managing livestock her entire life instead of just the past 10 minutes. "But if he gets tired, he can ride with us." The mule seemed to approve of this arrangement, stepping closer to the wagon and sniffing at the wooden sides with interest. Cole shook his head in amazement, wondering when this 9-year-old girl had become the voice of reason in their little group. But he began helping her rearrange the supplies, making room for their unexpected passenger, and trying not to think about what the neighbors would say when he showed up with a mule that was older than some of their children. The journey home took twice as long as usual, partly because of the mule's slow pace, but mostly because Cole found himself reluctant to end this strange, magical day. Sarah walked beside the mule for most of the trip, chattering away about everything and nothing, her voice bright with an excitement that Cole hadn't heard since before her parents died. The mule listened to every word, his ears constantly moving to track her voice, and occasionally he would respond with a soft whinny or a gentle nudge of his nose against her arm. Cole drove the wagon slowly, letting the old horse set an easy pace, and found himself stealing glances at the odd pair walking beside him. There was something about the way they moved together, the girl and the mule, that spoke of an instant and unshakable bond. They seemed to understand each other on a level that transcended species, that went beyond the simple relationship between human and animal to something deeper and more profound. It was the kind of connection that Cole had shared with his wife, that sense of being truly seen and understood by another soul, and watching it bloom between Sarah and the mule filled him with a bittersweet joy that he hadn't felt in years. The sun was beginning to set by the time they reached the ranch, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple that seemed to welcome them home. The other hands were waiting in the yard when they arrived, drawn by curiosity about what had taken Cole so long in town. They gathered around the wagon as he pulled it to a stop, their faces showing various degrees of surprise, amusement, and concern as they took in the sight of the ancient mule standing patiently beside Sarah. Tom Bradley, Cole's foreman and oldest friend, was the first to speak, his weathered face creased with the kind of grin that suggested he was trying very hard not to laugh. "Well, boss," he said, pushing his hat back on his head, "I was expecting you to come back with supplies, but I wasn't expecting you to bring home a new member of the family." The other men chuckled at this, but there was no meanness in their laughter, just the gentle ribbing that was part of ranch life. Cole climbed down from the wagon slowly, his joints protesting after the long day, and found himself at a loss for words. How could he explain what had happened at the market? The moment of connection between Sarah and the mule, the way it had changed everything. How could he make them understand that this wasn't just about saving an old animal, but about something much larger and more important? Sarah, however, had no such difficulty. She stepped forward, her hand still resting on the mule's neck, and looked each of the men in the eye with the serious intensity that was uniquely hers. "His name is Hope," she announced, as if this were a fact that had been established long ago rather than a decision she had just made. "And he's going to live here with us." The simplicity of her statement, the absolute certainty in her voice, seemed to settle the matter more effectively than any argument Cole could have made. The men nodded solemnly, as if they had been formally introduced to visiting royalty, and Tom stepped forward to offer his hand to the mule's nose. Hope sniffed at the foreman's calloused fingers, then allowed himself to be petted, his eyes drifting closed with contentment. "Well then, Hope," Tom said quietly, "welcome to the Double C Ranch." I reckon you'll find it a sight more peaceful than wherever you've been. And as the last light of day faded from the western sky, as the first stars began to appear overhead, Cole realized that Tom was right. They had all found something they hadn't known they were looking for, something that would change the way they saw the world and their place in it. The weeks that followed Hope's arrival at the Double C Ranch unfolded like the slow turning of seasons, each day bringing small revelations and quiet transformations that no one could have predicted. Sarah threw herself into the care of her new companion with the fierce dedication that only children possess, rising before dawn to check on him, spending every free moment in his company, and falling asleep each night with stories of their adventures together spilling from her lips. Hope, for his part, seemed to bloom under her attention like a desert flower after rain. His coat, which had been dull and lifeless at the market, began to show hints of its former richness, and though his back would always bear the sway of too many heavy loads, he carried himself with a dignity that spoke of renewed purpose. The other animals on the ranch accepted him with the easy grace that creatures show to one of their own, and even the barn cats, notorious for their aloofness, could often be found curled up against his warm flanks on cold mornings. But it was the change in Sarah that truly amazed everyone who knew her, the way she had emerged from the shell of grief that had enclosed her since her parents' death, like a butterfly finally ready to spread its wings and discover what it meant to fly. Mr. Cole found himself watching this transformation with a mixture of wonder and something that felt dangerously close to hope. The girl who had arrived at his ranch months ago, silent, withdrawn, moving through each day like a ghost haunting the edges of life, had been replaced by someone vibrant and alive, someone who laughed at Hope's antics and sang to him while she brushed his coat and chatted endlessly about plans for their future together. She had begun to help with other chores around the ranch as well, no longer content to simply exist in the spaces between other people's lives, but eager to contribute, to be useful, to matter. Cole caught her one morning, teaching Hope to respond to simple commands, her voice patient and encouraging as she guided him through the basic movements that would make him a useful member of their small community. The mule learned quickly, his intelligence shining through despite his age, and Cole realized with a start that the animal had probably never been given the chance to show what he could do, had been written off as worthless before anyone had bothered to discover his true capabilities. It was a lesson that cut deeper than Cole cared to admit, a reminder of how easy it was to overlook the value in things that didn't immediately announce their worth to the world. The transformation wasn't limited to Sarah and Hope, though their bond remained the bright center around which everything else revolved. The entire ranch seemed to have taken on a different quality, as if the presence of these two unlikely companions had shifted something fundamental in the very air they all breathed. The hands worked with more purpose, their conversations peppered with stories about Hope's latest accomplishment or Sarah's newest idea for improving his comfort. Tom Bradley, who had been Cole's right hand for more than a decade, began staying after dinner to listen to Sarah's plans for training Hope to pull a small cart, nodding seriously as she explained her theories about animal psychology with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that such things were possible. Even Cole himself felt the change, found himself looking forward to each new day in a way he hadn't since his wife's death, found himself believing again that the future might hold something worth anticipating. The ranch had always been a place of hard work and simple pleasures, but now it felt like something more, a place where broken things could be mended, where lost souls could find their way home, where the impossible could become routine if you just had enough faith to let it happen. One evening in late autumn, as the first frost painted the grass silver and the air carried the sharp promise of winter, Cole found Sarah and Hope in the pasture behind the barn, silhouetted against the dying light like figures from a painting. The girl was sitting on a fallen log, her legs swinging freely, while the mule stood beside her with his head lowered so she could scratch behind his ears. They were both perfectly still, perfectly content, and Cole felt something shift in his chest as he watched them, a loosening of the tight knot of grief and regret that had lived there for so long. He had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without its weight. He thought about the day at the market, about the moment when everything had changed, about the choice that had seemed so simple at the time, but had turned out to be the most important decision he had made in years. He had saved Hope's life that day, but in truth, the mule had saved something in return, had given Sarah a reason to smile again, had given the ranch a sense of purpose it had been missing, had given Cole himself a glimpse of the man he used to be before sorrow had worn him down to nothing but duty and routine. The wind picked up, rustling through the dry grass and carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from the house, and Cole realized that he was no longer afraid of what tomorrow might bring. As winter settled over the Kansas plains with its familiar weight of cold and silence, Hope proved his worth in ways that surprised everyone, including Cole. Despite his age and the limitations of his worn body, the mule threw himself into the work of the ranch with an enthusiasm that shamed some of the younger animals. He learned to pull the small cart that Sarah had envisioned, carrying supplies to the far pastures and hauling firewood from the forest with a steady determination that never wavered. He became Sarah's constant companion on her explorations of the property, his sure feet and calm temperament making him the perfect mount for a girl who was still learning to navigate the world without the safety net of parents to catch her if she fell. But more than his practical contributions, Hope brought something intangible to the ranch, a sense of possibility, a reminder that value couldn't always be measured in dollars and cents, that sometimes the most important things were the ones that couldn't be quantified or sold or traded away. The other ranchers in the area began to take notice, drawn by stories of the miracle mule who had been saved from the slaughterhouse and transformed into something extraordinary. They came to see for themselves, these hard men who had spent their lives dealing in the harsh realities of profit and loss, and they left shaking their heads in wonder at what they had witnessed. On Christmas morning, as snow fell softly outside the windows and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Sarah presented Hope with a gift she had been working on in secret for weeks, a halter made from soft leather that Tom had helped her tool with intricate designs, decorated with small silver bells that chimed gently with every movement. Hope stood perfectly still as she fitted it over his head, his dark eyes bright with what could only be described as joy, and when she stepped back to admire her handiwork, he lowered his great head and nuzzled her cheek with a gentleness that brought tears to every eye in the room. Cole watched this exchange from his chair by the fire, his coffee growing cold in his hands, and felt the last of his defenses crumble away like walls that had outlived their purpose. He had spent so many years protecting himself from the possibility of loss, from the pain that came with caring too much, that he had forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive. But Sarah and Hope had reminded him, had shown him that the risk of heartbreak was a small price to pay for the privilege of love, that some things were worth fighting for even when, especially when, the world insisted they had no value at all.